They thought they'd won. I was standing in my own living room watching my family celebrate, champagne popping, glasses raised. While they talked about my house like it already belonged to them, they believed I was cornered, that I'd cry, that I'd beg, that I'd eventually give in. What they didn't know was that I'd already secured everything they were trying to take from me, and by the time they realized it, it was too late. Let me tell you how my own family tried to take my home, and how I survived by doing the one thing they never expected. I stood in the doorway of what used to be my living room and watched them pop the champagne. The sound echoed off walls I'd painted 3 times over the years, trying to get the color just right. My sister-in-law held the bottle, laughing as the foam spilled onto the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself one summer when money was tight. My brother raised his glass toward the bay window, the one I'd saved for 2 years to install, and said something about finally having the space they deserved. I didn't cry. I'd done all my crying weeks ago, alone, in a hotel room that smelled like industrial cleaner and someone else's cigarette smoke. Now I just felt hollow and clear, dangerously clear. They thought this was my ending. They had no idea it was theirs. The house had been my grandmother's before it was mine. She'd left it to me specifically, not to my father, not split between the grandchildren, to me. I was 23 when she died, barely out of college, working 2 jobs and trying to figure out what adulthood even meant. The house was a 1920s craftsman in a neighborhood that hadn't been fashionable yet, with good bones and decades of deferred maintenance. It needed everything: new roof, updated electrical. The kitchen was avocado green and harvest gold, frozen in 1974. I loved it instantly. My grandmother had raised me more than my own mother had, if I'm being honest. My mum left when I was 7, just walked out one Tuesday afternoon and never came back. Called a few times over the years, sent a card on my 16th birthday with no return address. My father did his best, but he worked long hours and didn't know what to do with a daughter who asked too many questions and cried too easily. So I stayed with my grandmother most weekends, then most weeks, then just moved in officially when I was 14. She taught me how to make pie crust from scratch, how to identify the sound a house makes when the foundation settles versus when there's actually something wrong. She taught me that being alone isn't the same as being lonely, and that the most important promises you make are the ones you make to yourself. When she left me the house, my father was hurt. I could see it in his face at the lawyer's office, the way his jaw tightened when they read that clause. But he didn't fight it. He knew why she'd done it. He'd remarried by then, Sharon, a woman with 2 grown sons and a timeshare in Scottsdale. They had their own life. I had the house. I spent the next 12 years turning it into something beautiful. I learned how to tile, how to snake a drain, how to match paint colors in natural light. I took out a small loan to replace the roof and paid it back in 3 years. I haunted estate sales and architectural salvage yards, finding original light fixtures and period-appropriate hardware. I planted a garden in the back, roses and lavender and a little herb bed near the kitchen door. I adopted a cat from the shelter, a grey tabby who liked to sleep in the sunny spot by the dining room window. I had relationships that didn't work out. I had jobs that paid the bills, but never quite felt like enough. But I always had the house. It was the one constant, the one thing that was completely mine. When I couldn't sleep, I'd walk through the rooms and touch the walls and feel my grandmother's presence, feel the years of work I'd put in, feel the safety of it. My brother, David, never visited much. He lived 2 hours away with his wife, Monica, in a newer development with an HOA and a community pool. They had good jobs. He was in pharmaceutical sales. She worked in marketing. They'd always seemed fine, comfortable. Their Christmas cards showed them smiling in front of various vacation destinations. I was happy for them. Then their investments went bad. I didn't hear about it directly from David. I heard it from my father, who mentioned it casually over lunch one day about 4 years ago. Something about a real estate venture that fell through. Some money they'd borrowed against their retirement. He said it with that tone people use when they're trying not to sound worried, but absolutely are. David called me 2 weeks later. We hadn't spoken in months. Our relationship had always been polite, but distant. He asked how I was doing, asked about the house, made small talk about weather and work. Then he said Monica wanted to come visit, maybe spend a weekend, reconnect as family. I was surprised but pleased. I said yes. They came that spring. Monica brought expensive wine and fresh flowers. She complimented everything: the tile work in the bathroom, the built-in shelving I'd installed in the den, the way the light came through the stained glass panel in the front door. David was quieter than usual, but I chalked it up to stress. My father had mentioned things were still tight for them financially. We sat in the backyard that Saturday evening, drinking the wine Monica had brought, watching the sun set behind the neighbor's oak tree. That's when Monica first said it. So casually, I almost missed it. You know, if you ever wanted to travel or needed to liquidate, this place would sell for a fortune now. I laughed. I said I wasn't going anywhere. This was home. She smiled and said, of course, but it was just nice to know you had options. Security. I didn't think much of it at the time. They started visiting more often after that, once a month, then twice. Monica would bring paint samples and show me articles about maximizing property value. David started noticing things: the fence that needed repair, the slight crack in the driveway, the outdated electrical panel. He worried aloud about my safety. What if something happened? What if I needed cash for an emergency? Had I thought about a home equity line of credit? I told them I was fine. I'd always been fine. My father's health started declining about 2 years ago. Diabetes complications, then a small stroke. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to scare him. Enough to make him start talking about legacy and making sure everything was in order. Sharon pushed him to update his will. She pushed hard. At Sunday dinners, the conversation kept circling back to my house. My father would mention property taxes going up. Sharon would talk about elderly women living alone and all the terrible news stories. David would suggest I at least get the place appraised, just to know what I was sitting on. I had it appraised. The number shocked me. The neighborhood had changed completely. Young families with money were buying up the old craftsmen and bungalows, renovating them, turning them into showpieces. My house, with all the work I'd put in, was worth 7 times what my grandmother had paid for it. I didn't tell them the exact number, but they knew it was substantial. I could see it in the way they looked at each other. Monica started having financial anxiety attacks, she told me. The stress was affecting her health. They were going to lose their house if something didn't change. David looked exhausted all the time. My father suggested, gently at first, that maybe I could help them out. Family helps family. Wasn't that what Grandma would have wanted? I offered them $20,000. It was most of my savings, but I could rebuild it. They were family. Monica cried when I gave them the check. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. She said I was saving their lives. David was quieter, but he thanked me, said he'd pay me back within the year. They didn't pay me back. Instead, 6 months later, my father had another stroke, a bad one. He survived, but the recovery was long and ugly. Sharon was overwhelmed. David stepped in to help with medical decisions, power of attorney paperwork, all the logistics of managing my father's care and finances. That's when the conversations changed. Sharon started talking about how expensive my father's care was going to be, how they might need to sell his house, but the market was bad timing, how if only there were other assets they could leverage. David came to visit me alone one afternoon. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in days. He said Monica was having panic attacks every night. They'd borrowed from the wrong people trying to save their investments. He didn't specify who the wrong people were, but the implication was clear. He said they needed help, real help. He asked if I'd consider selling the house and splitting the proceeds with them, just until they got back on their feet. I said no. I said it as gently as I could, but I said no. He got angry then. He said I was being selfish, that I didn't have children, didn't have a spouse, didn't need all that space. That family was supposed to take care of family, that Grandma would be ashamed of me. I asked him to leave. He did, but not before saying things I'd rather not repeat. My father called me the next day. His speech was still slurred from the stroke. He said he understood the house was important to me, but he asked me to think about my brother, about family legacy, about what really mattered in life. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I kept walking through the rooms, touching the walls, trying to hold on to what I knew was true. This was my house. My grandmother had left it to me for a reason. I didn't owe David my home, but the guilt was crushing. Sharon called me 2 weeks later. She said my father was getting worse. The stress of worrying about David was affecting his recovery. She said, very calmly, very kindly, that if something happened to him, if he died from this stress, I'd have to live with that. I felt that like a physical blow. That's when Monica reached out. She wanted to meet for coffee, just the two of us. No David, no drama. She said she wanted to apologize for the pressure, for everything. I met her. She brought documents with her. An agreement she said her lawyer had drafted, just to explore options. It wasn't a sale, she explained. It was a family trust arrangement. I would deed the house into a trust, with all of us as beneficiaries. That way, if anything ever happened to me, or if I needed care like my father did, everything would be protected. The house would stay in the family. It seemed almost reasonable the way she explained it. She had answers for every concern I raised. She was calm and professional and sisterly. She said we could all sign it together, make it official, take the stress off everyone. I told her I needed to think about it. She said, of course, but maybe not too long. My father's health was so precarious, and timing mattered with these legal things. I called a lawyer that week, not the family lawyer Sharon and David had been using, a different one, someone I found through a colleague. I explained the situation. She listened carefully and then told me not to sign anything. She said the trust arrangement Monica described would effectively mean I no longer owned the house, that I'd be giving up all control. I sat with that information for 3 days. Then I called David and told him I wasn't going to sign the trust. I said I was sorry they were struggling, but the house was mine and it was going to stay mine. He said I'd regret it. He said I was destroying our family. He hung up. My father called an hour later. This time he wasn't kind. He said I was just like my mother, selfish, cold, thinking only of myself. He said my grandmother would be disgusted by what I'd become. That broke something in me I didn't know could break. I spent that night on the bathroom floor, hyperventilating, trying to understand how wanting to keep what was mine made me a monster, trying to understand how 12 years of work and love and careful stewardship meant nothing compared to their immediate needs. The next morning, I woke up to an email from Sharon. She'd attached a letter my father had supposedly written. It was shaky, probably dictated, but it said he was changing his will, that he couldn't leave anything to a daughter who refused to help her own family in crisis, that everything would go to David. I had never expected to inherit from my father anyway, but seeing it weaponized like that, seeing love turned into a transaction, it clarified something. I started making calls, quiet calls, careful calls. I called my lawyer and asked about options for protecting my ownership. She suggested a recorded deed with specific language making it impossible to challenge. We filed it within the week. I called my bank and moved my money to a different institution, one with no connection to any family accounts. I started documenting everything, every text message, every email, every voicemail. I kept a journal with dates and times and exact quotes when I could remember them. And I started researching. I found out that Monica had been lying about the severity of their financial situation. They hadn't borrowed from dangerous people. They'd made bad investments and gotten over-leveraged, but there was no mob, no loan sharks. They just wanted to maintain a lifestyle they couldn't afford anymore. I found out that Sharon had been pushing my father to pressure me because she wanted him to sell his house and move in with her permanently, but she didn't want the responsibility of his care without additional money coming in. I found out David had been talking to real estate agents about my house for months, getting appraisals, discussing listing strategies, before he'd ever asked me to sell. They'd been planning this, not spontaneously, not out of desperate panic. They'd been strategizing how to separate me from my house. If you're listening to this and it feels familiar, you can support this story by quietly liking the video. It helps more women find it. And if you feel comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It reminds me I'm not alone. I didn't confront them with what I'd learned. I just went quiet, stopped answering calls, stopped going to Sunday dinners, let them think I was ashamed or hurt or shutting down. What I was actually doing was preparing. I consulted with an estate attorney about ironclad protection strategies. I set up a living trust with me as the sole trustee and beneficiary, with specific instructions that it could never be contested or modified under duress. I had the house reappraised by 3 different companies and kept all the documentation. I gathered 12 years of receipts for every repair, every upgrade, every dollar I'd put into the property. I consulted with a family therapist who specialized in financial abuse and manipulation. She confirmed what I'd suspected. This was textbook coercive control. They were isolating me, creating false urgency, weaponizing my father's health and my fear of abandonment. The therapist helped me write a script for when they escalated, because they would escalate. They did, 3 weeks later. My father had another medical episode, minor, but Sharon used it to call a family meeting. She said we needed to settle this before it killed him. She said I was being unreasonable and cruel, and that she'd helped arrange a meeting with a mediator, someone neutral who could help us find a solution. The mediator was Monica's cousin. I found that out later. I went to the meeting. I sat there while they presented their case. How worried they were about me. How the house was too much for me to handle alone. How the neighborhood was changing and becoming dangerous. How I clearly wasn't thinking straight because I'd isolated myself. They had a new proposal. I would sell the house, and we'd split the proceeds 3 ways. Me, David, and my father's estate. That way, everyone benefited. That way, it was fair. The mediator called it a reasonable compromise. I said no. David exploded. He called me every name you can imagine. He said I was mentally unstable, that I needed intervention, that he was going to pursue legal conservatorship if I wouldn't see reason. I left, walked out mid-sentence, and drove home, shaking so hard I had to pull over twice. That night, they showed up at my house. David, Monica, Sharon. My father wasn't with them. He was too sick, Sharon said, but he'd asked them to make me understand. They wouldn't leave. They stood on my porch and rang the doorbell and knocked and called my phone. Monica was crying. David was shouting. Sharon kept saying they just wanted to talk, just wanted me to listen to reason. I called the police. The officer who responded was kind but confused. This was a family dispute, he said. Maybe we should all calm down and talk it through. I showed him the messages on my phone, the threats about conservatorship. He made them leave, but suggested I consider working things out amicably. After he left, I sat in my empty house and realized I couldn't win this fight directly. They had more of them. They had my father's health as leverage. They had the social narrative of family unity on their side. So I stopped fighting. I called David the next morning. I said I'd been thinking it over. I said maybe I had been unreasonable. I said I needed some time to process everything, but I was willing to consider options. He was instantly warmer, relieved. He said he was glad I was seeing sense. He said we'd figure it out together, as family. I asked for 2 months to get my head straight, to consult with my own advisors, to make sure whatever we did was done right. He agreed. What I actually did during those 2 months was construct an exit strategy. I started moving my grandmother's things first, the pieces that mattered, her jewelry, her photo albums, her collection of first edition books. I stored them with my lawyer in a secure facility. I digitized everything, every photo on the walls, every document, every piece of paper with her handwriting. I backed it up in 3 separate locations. I quietly interviewed property managers and real estate attorneys. I learned about leaseback arrangements, about trusts that could own rental properties, about ways to protect assets from family claims. I met with a financial advisor and moved my money into accounts they couldn't touch or trace. I set up automatic payments for all my bills from those new accounts. I applied for jobs in other cities, not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed options, leverage, and I let them think I was cooperating. I met with their lawyer. I asked questions that sounded like engagement, but were actually me gathering information about their strategy. I expressed concerns that made me sound hesitant but movable. David started getting confident. He'd call me and talk about their plans for the house once it was ours, the renovations they'd do, how they'd rent it out for income, or maybe sell it and split it, or maybe they'd move in themselves and finally have the space Monica had always wanted. He didn't notice I never actually agreed to anything. I just listened. Sharon started planning what she'd do with my father's share of the proceeds, a better care facility, maybe a vacation home somewhere warm. Monica sent me Pinterest boards of design ideas for the house, her vision for it. I smiled and said it looked nice. The deadline I'd asked for was approaching, 2 months. They wanted to meet again, finalize everything, get my signature on the paperwork their lawyer had prepared. I scheduled the meeting for a Friday afternoon. I told them I was ready. I told them I'd thought it through, and I understood this was what family did for each other. Monica actually hugged me when I arrived. She said she was proud of me for being mature about this. We sat down. Their lawyer laid out the documents. a sale agreement, papers that would transfer the title to an LLC they'd formed, David and Monica as managing members, my father as a passive investor. They'd generously included a clause that I could rent the property from them at market rate if I wanted to stay. The lawyer pushed the papers across the table. He handed me a pen. I looked at David, at Monica, at Sharon. Then I said no, not angry, not dramatic, just clear and final. No. David's face went purple. He started shouting immediately. Monica joined in. Sharon tried to play peacemaker, but even she was sharp, saying I'd wasted everyone's time, that I'd agreed to this. I hadn't agreed. I'd said I'd consider it. I'd said I'd meet. I never promised anything. Their lawyer started talking about legal options, about how I might not be mentally competent to make these decisions, about conservatorship proceedings. I pulled out my phone and played a recording, not of this meeting. I hadn't recorded this one, but of the conversation 3 months ago when David had first started threatening legal action if I didn't comply, his voice, clear as day, saying he'd do whatever it took to get that house. Their lawyer went quiet. I told them I'd consulted with my own attorney, that my ownership was documented and protected in ways they couldn't challenge, that any attempt to pursue conservatorship would be met with evidence of coercion, manipulation, and financial abuse, that I had documentation of everything. I told them the house was mine. It would always be mine, and they needed to accept that. David said things I won't repeat. Monica cried, not sad tears, angry ones. Sharon called me ungrateful. I left. I went home, locked my doors, and waited. They tried everything over the next 2 weeks. More threats, more guilt. My father called, crying, saying I was killing him. Sharon said I'd destroyed our family. David showed up at my house again, but this time I didn't answer the door. I just watched through the window until he left. Then they tried a different approach. They challenged my grandmother's will. They filed a claim saying she'd been unduly influenced, that she hadn't been of sound mind when she'd left the house to me specifically. They claimed I'd manipulated her. It was lies, all lies. But it was expensive lies that required me to hire attorneys and show up to court and defend myself against people who were supposed to love me. My lawyer was excellent. She buried them in documentation, medical records showing my grandmother had been sharp until the day she died, testimony from her longtime doctor, the original will, written years before her death and updated regularly, always with the same instructions about the house. The judge dismissed their claim in under an hour. I thought that would be the end. I was wrong. 3 weeks later, I came home to find notices taped to my door. Code violations. The city had received complaints about unpermitted work, about safety hazards, about zoning violations. Every single complaint was from anonymous sources. Every single one was either false or based on work I'd done years ago with proper permits that had long since been closed. But I had to respond to each one, had to have inspectors come through, had to pull out permits from a decade ago and prove everything was legitimate. It cost me time and money and sleep. It was harassment dressed up as civic duty. I knew it was them. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. I kept records of that too. Then the harassment started getting more personal. Someone slashed my tires, twice. Someone left dead flowers on my porch. I started getting strange calls at night, just breathing, no words. I installed security cameras. I documented everything. My father died 4 months into this nightmare. The stroke complications finally caught up with him. I found out 3 days after it happened, because no one told me. I saw it on Sharon's Facebook page. I didn't go to the funeral. I wasn't invited. His will, when it was read, left everything to David, just like Sharon had threatened. I hadn't expected anything different, but seeing it in writing, seeing that final rejection, it still hurt in ways I hadn't prepared for. David inherited the house my father had shared with Sharon, some savings, a car. Sharon kept making noise about how it wasn't enough, about how if I'd just helped when they'd asked, my father could have died with peace of mind. I didn't respond. I just kept living my life. The harassment eventually stopped. Maybe they ran out of ideas. Maybe they got tired. Maybe harassing me was expensive in ways they hadn't anticipated. I changed jobs, not to leave the city, but for a better opportunity, better pay. I stayed in my house. I kept my garden. I adopted another cat. For a long time, I thought that was the end of the story. They'd failed to take my house. I'd survived the aftermath. And now we just existed in completely separate worlds. Then, almost 2 years after my father's death, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. It was Monica. Her voice was different, smaller, tired. She said she needed to tell me something. She said she'd been carrying it for too long, and it was eating her alive. I almost hung up, but something in her tone stopped me. She told me that the financial crisis they'd described, the desperate situation they'd claimed, justified everything. It had been real, but not the way they'd presented it. David hadn't borrowed from dangerous people. He'd embezzled from his company. Not a lot, she said, like that mattered, but enough that when the internal audit caught it, he'd had to repay it immediately or face charges. They'd needed money fast. The house, my house, had seemed like the solution. He'd convinced Monica it was rightfully his anyway, that our grandmother had been manipulated by me, that I didn't deserve it. She said she'd believed him at first. Then she'd gone along with it because she was scared. Then she'd doubled down because she was in too deep. She said she was sorry. She said she knew it didn't matter now, that sorry didn't fix anything, but she needed me to know. I asked her why she was telling me this now. She said because David had done it again, embezzled again, from a different company. This time there was no repayment option. This time there would be charges. She was filing for divorce. She was losing everything anyway, and she wanted to at least lose it with some honesty. I thanked her for telling me. I didn't forgive her. I just thanked her and hung up. I heard later through the small-town network that never quite lets you disappear that David was facing federal charges, that Monica had indeed divorced him, that Sharon had moved to Arizona to be near her own children, wanted nothing more to do with any of it. I could have felt vindicated. I could have felt victorious. Mostly I just felt tired. The house is still mine. I still live here. The garden has matured. The roses are spectacular now, wild and fragrant. I've redone the kitchen again, this time with vintage tile I found at an estate sale 3 towns over. I've hosted Thanksgiving for friends who became family, the kind of family you choose instead of the kind you're born into. I think about my grandmother often. I think she knew, somehow, what kind of fight leaving me this house would create. I think she knew I'd need something solid to hold on to, something that couldn't be taken away easily, something worth fighting for. I think she knew that learning to say no, really firmly, finally no, would be the most important inheritance she could give me. Sometimes late at night, when the house settles and the cat is curled up on my lap and the moonlight comes through that bay window that I'd sacrificed so much to keep, I wonder what would have happened if I'd given in, if I'd signed the papers, if I'd chosen temporary peace over long-term integrity. I'd be somewhere else right now, probably in a small apartment, helping David and Monica pay their legal bills, still trying to earn my way back into a family that only valued me for what I could provide. Instead, I'm here, in my grandmother's house, in my house. The walls remember everything, the floors I refinished, the garden I planted, the late nights I spent choosing paint colors, and the early mornings I spent ripping out old wallpaper. Every decision I made to honor this place, to honor her, to honor myself. They celebrated taking my home. They popped champagne and planned their futures in my space. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I'd already secured something far more valuable than the deed to a house. I'd secured myself, my autonomy, my right to my own life. And that, it turns out, was something no trust agreement or family pressure or legal threat could ever touch. I don't speak to David anymore. I don't speak to Sharon. Monica sent me a card last Christmas. Nothing written inside except her name. I didn't respond. I don't hate them. Hate requires a kind of ongoing investment I'm not willing to make. I just don't think about them unless something specifically reminds me, and those reminders come less and less frequently as time passes. My life now is quiet in the best way. I have work I care about. I have friendships built on mutual respect instead of obligation. I have Sunday mornings in my garden and Friday evenings reading on the porch, and a sense of peace I didn't think was possible during those darkest months. The house needs a new roof again soon, 15 years since the last one. I've already started saving for it. I've already started researching contractors. I'll do it the same way I did it the first time, carefully, properly, with my own money and my own choices. because this is mine. Not because someone gave it to me out of pity or obligation. Not because I manipulated or coerced or threatened anyone. It's mine because I fought for it when fighting meant standing still and saying no. Because I protected it when protection meant being called selfish and cruel and cold. Because I valued it enough to lose everything else. I think that's what my grandmother understood that my father never did. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is give them something they'll have to fight to keep. Something that will teach them who they are and what they're capable of and where their boundaries lie. This house taught me all of that. It taught me that grace under pressure isn't about never feeling afraid. It's about feeling terrified and moving forward anyway. It taught me that patience isn't weakness. Sometimes patience is the strongest form of resistance there is. It taught me that the people who love you don't weaponize that love. They don't turn your loyalty into a tool to pry away your security. And it taught me that you can survive losing family. It hurts, and it leaves scars, but you can survive it, especially when the alternative is losing yourself. I still have the photo of my grandmother that used to hang in her bedroom. It's in my bedroom now. In a frame I restored myself. She's young in the picture, maybe 30, standing in front of this same house when it was new and she was a new bride. She's smiling, but not for the camera. She's looking at something just outside the frame, and her expression is pure joy. I look at that photo sometimes and try to imagine what she'd think of everything that happened, whether she'd be proud of how I handled it, or disappointed that I let it fracture the family so completely. Then I remember what she told me once, years before she died. I was maybe 16, upset about some friend drama that felt catastrophic at the time. She said, "People will always want to tell you who you should be. The trick is learning to hear yourself louder than you hear them." I think she'd say I finally learned that trick. I think she'd say the fracture wasn't something I caused. It was something that revealed what was already broken. I think she'd say that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's survival. And I think she'd be glad I'm still here, in her house, in my house, living a life that's small and quiet and entirely my own. The champagne they popped that day, the celebration they had in my living room while I stood in the doorway watching, I think about it sometimes. How sure they were, how final they thought it all was. I wonder if they ever think about it now. If David, sitting in whatever facility he's in, remembers the taste of that champagne and realizes how much it cost him. If Monica looks back and recognizes the exact moment she could have chosen differently. If Sharon ever wonders whether pushing so hard was worth it, I'll never know, and I don't need to. What I know is this: they thought they were taking my foundation. Instead, they helped me build one they could never touch. So here I am, still standing, still in my house, still tending my garden and refinishing my floors and choosing paint colors in natural light. Still learning what my grandmother tried to teach me all along, that the most valuable thing you should own isn't a house or money or family approval. It's the unshakable knowledge of who you are when everything else is stripped away. And when you have that, when you really have it, no one can take anything that matters. Not ever. What's the thing you thought you lost that taught you who you really are?